Take it for a spin. All right, here I go. And what I'm not mentioning is my own experience with my own superpowers. So since I was a kid, I had a very close relationship with my future self, and would have precognitive dreams that were very accurate and still do. So that's just part of who I am. So, okay. So it starts with this idea of what is the non-conscious. I think the most fundamental distinction that there is in human experience is between what we're consciously aware of. I'm going to call that above the line. Let's imagine a line. What we're consciously aware of at any one moment and what we're not consciously aware of at any one moment. And that changes over time, right? Conscious processing is, we're aware of it. We're aware of at least the outcome of conscious processing. It's like when you deliberate on what kind of thing to buy in the store, and you know you're deliberating about it, and you're like, oh, I just can't choose this and that and this and that. That's conscious, right? Non-conscious processing, we do so much more of, and it's harder to talk about because people aren't aware of it. So you can always doubt it exists, but you can also study it to determine that it does exist. And that includes when you automatically just do things. Like right now, I have non-conscious processing going on that's determining how I'm walking, how I'm talking, how I'm breathing. It's determining how I will shape my mouth to say the next word. It's determining what the next word's going to be. It's determining what kind of impact that I want the words to have on the audience. None of that stuff is conscious. If it were conscious, I couldn't function, right?
Sure.
So the amount of stuff that we're doing below this line is incredible. It's parallel, it's complex, it takes into account many more factors. Above the line, it's serial, so one processing at a time. It can take into account at most 4 factors, generally, most people, and it's simple. So you have these two symptoms. You have these two systems. One is capable of doing so much more computation than the other, and the other is the one we're conscious of. We're biased towards thinking that the conscious one is the super important one because it's the one we're conscious of.
Right.
However, if you were an engineer and you were creating a system and it had these 2 parts, which part would you allow to sleep at night? You'd allow the conscious mind to sleep because it's the kind of stupid one, right? It's the one that needs its sleep.
Yep.
The other one's in charge. The other one's actually breathing for the person. It's deciding what's going on. It's making sure all the muscles are working. And it's calculating at an intellectual level as well. know about time, everything we know about time is through our conscious experience of time. That's everything we know intuitively about time. We can get information about time, about the features of time that are not available to our conscious mind by doing experiments, right? That inform us about the outcome of experiments, of manipulations that are designed to help us understand time, how time relates to non-conscious processes, and how time in the physical world exists. In the physical world, we know that there's this problem. Physicists, especially in the last decade or two, have started to say out loud, there's this problem, which is that most physical equations are time reversible, which means there's a solution forward in time and there's a solution backwards in time. And frankly, there's nothing to determine except for our own conscious experience, our own perceptions of how things work, which of those makes sense. So that's pretty profound. Then there's a group of physicists who study the second law of thermodynamics. So the second law of thermodynamics says you have a bunch of gas particles in a box and you don't have any energy going into the system. Eventually over time, they'll be dissipating and they'll be at equal distances from each other. And so basically entropy either stays the same or it increases over time. So some people started to point to that to say that's an arrow of time. But then it became clear that that arrow of time uses our conscious experience, our perception of what's happening in the universe to order it. In other words, it's circular. You're trying to explain why time goes in one direction by using a law that was created with the assumption that time goes in one direction, right? So it's sort of like, okay, that fails pretty spectacularly. Not to mention it only applies to closed systems. So human beings are open systems, we eat lunch. Right. So all bets are off. So there's something to explain here, which is why the human experience, conscious experience of time, seems to go one direction. Why we universally, cross-culturally, experience being babies before, we have this word before, experience being old, right? That's real. That's an experience, it's very robust. Like you do not have to run a survey to find out, like, were you a baby before now, or is that gonna come in the future? You do not have to do that. It's very clear. It's like gravity, it's so clear, right? You drop an apple and like, no one thinks it floats up. Very few people think it floats up unless you toss it up. So that's a profoundly consistent experience, but it doesn't match what we know about physical reality. So what could be going on? And so plenty of physicists are trying to answer the question, and psychologists are trying to answer the question about why we must have only one direction of time, that why the universe forces us into a single direction of time. But another answer is, maybe it's the case that conscious experience, it's slow, it's serial, it's stupid. Maybe it needs one direction of time because that's what it can handle. Maybe the definition of experience means one thing happening at a time. So you have to choose a direction. You don't get to go in both directions at once, right? But it's also possible that underneath that line, the non-conscious processes, they're faster, they're parallel, they're more complex. They could handle this. Dropping a pebble in the water and processing the waves coming out in both directions. It's possible that these non-conscious processes, in addition to being in touch with, you know, how to pick up this glass of water and take a sip without choking, for the most part, is in touch with how to do that. That's very close to the physical world. That's like really understanding the complexity of the nervous system, of muscles, of balance, of movement, all that stuff, completely without conscious thought. That if it has that capacity to do that, then it also could have this capacity to be processing these waves coming out from an event on both directions in time. So the thing I think we really need, I mean, another approach to all this is saying, look, what we really need to describe and understand is why the conscious mind above this line needs to have a single direction in time, when most physical and psychological data suggests that we can process a lot of information in both directions in time. People who exhibit the ability will claim that they don't have the ability. As their bodies will show you that they have the ability. They'll get a change in heart rate according to some future event that's non-predictable according to normal means. You know, people talk about that we live in a simulation. I kind of said, yeah, the simulation is the conscious experience.
Right. Right.
It's being simulated by the non-conscious. So double slit experiment, I was the standard interpretation of getting an interference pattern from the light source when there's these two slits and only a single particle going through, is that the particle's going through each of those slits. It's like this magical, cool, physics 101 thing in college where you learn it's going through both slits at the same time. It's not a billiard ball. Okay. So I have for like at least a decade, every time I read a description in a more technical document about that experiment, I just kept thinking, why it's weird to say it's in two places at once, especially because there's only one little dot registered on the detector, screen at the end, but it's in two places when it's going through the slit. So what's the story with that?
Right.
And I just kept thinking, well, it's equally weird for a particle to be at two places at once as it is to be in two times at once. So what if it's interfering with a future version of itself or even another photon from the future?
Right.
Right? What if that other photon, it's going through one slit, the one that comes out of the lamp, and a photon from the future is going through the other slit? What would that be like? Okay, so I'm going to start here because most people think of time from left to right. So in a physiology experiment, you might be going along and recording someone's physiology, let's say their heart rhythm.
Yeah.
And that at this point, some event happens. And it's either an emotional event, like a loud sound, or a neutral event, like a sound that goes shh, quiet, and it's randomly selected. So the physiology results in presentiment, or the form of precognition that's physiological is called presentiment.
Yep.
Physiology results show that before a neutral sound, you're like this, heartbeat's just going along. And before a loud sound, you're like this. Heartbeat goes up, and then down, something like that. That's the general result. So it looks a lot like that in this experiment. Photons, when it's going to be long, are up here. This is the time of the decision. Up, 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 up. It doesn't even respond to the decision. Up, 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 up. Photons in a short period. Down, 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 down. Let's say it stops right here. So I think it's pretty hard to not conclude there's some kind of substrate or some kind of mechanism that is driving both of those that has to do with almost, physicists hate it. I'm not a physicist, right? My training is in cognitive neuroscience and technology, but physicists hate it when I talk about this because it feels like time is water. It's like it's behaving like water. Like an event that's important to whatever the organism is or whatever the device is, an event that's important is here. And that is causing waves backwards in time and forwards in time. Back pressure in the water and a wake over here. And it acts like that in physiology, and it acts like that in this optical system. So here's the spiritual piece that I think in a nutshell.
Sure.
When I was connecting with my future self when I was a kid, and now when I connect with my future self and also my past self, the experience is not of difference, but of sameness, of like, what feels wonderful is, there you are, there I am. All right, we're just like, this is the same. The essence of who I am is the same. And that's what's relaxing. That's what brings inner peace. Is like when I was in trauma as a child and going through difficult things, seeing in my mind's eye my future self in my 40s in that chair next to my bed and having her tell me, like, not through, it wasn't a hallucination. It was like a vision, you know what I mean? Having her tell me, like, yes, you know what, you're going to be okay. Notice that I'm okay and I'm you. Like, that's the message. Like the you-ness, the uniqueness, the essence, the central core is intact and it's inviolable, which is an incredibly strengthening experience. The only thing I know that can help you survive really rough situations is this recognition of the essence of who I am cannot be violated. I can go through pain, I can go through torture, I can go through suffering, but there's an essence of who I am that transcends time. And so it's not the change that I notice, it's the sameness, and that is very calming and soothing to me. The changes happen around me, around that central core. They're superficial, right? Changes in knowledge, like insights that occur to me as I go on my path. But I have now developed such a trust in these insights that I know that they come when I need them. So I just sort of, they come, and then it's like a dance. It's like I'm not in a state of suffering because I want an insight and I don't have it. I don't bang my head against the wall. They come or they don't come, or I take a nap, or, you know, it's very fluid.
Right.
And I feel it's like touched by grace. I feel very lucky about that. I mean, I think that has to do with recognizing this connectivity over time. Last night, in fact, I woke up in the middle of the night and had some cool thoughts about memory and how memory works. And one way that memory can work is the standard way we think of it. It's like if you have to remember that there is a baseball, if that's what you need to remember, you can have two parts and that toss the baseball back and forth. Just to say, yeah, there's a baseball, there's a baseball. So one remembers it for the other when the other can't remember it, if they have short memory cycles. But another way to remember it is to have a very long memory cycle that spans the lifetime of the organism. I had to be very careful. If you have a family with a mental illness history, or if you have a mental illness history, I think first, if you have a family with a mental illness history, that was my case, I had to be very careful, just because I'm always careful around things like psychedelics or anything that could take me from my state of consciousness in which I am functional with the physical world, because I have such a thin line between that and my non-conscious mind. And then for people who have a mental illness history, I think you have to be very careful that you're in a supportive environment, because most of the world right now says that this stuff is crazy, or it means that your mind is foofy or wishy-washy. And so you can, and if you have a history of mental illness, you can start to be a little nuts with it, right? You can start to go down the rabbit hole of, I had a dream about the plane crash. And then 4 days later, there's a plane crash and you're like, see, there was one in Venezuela. I'm like, well, there's always a little plane crash someplace within a couple of days of when, right? I mean, so you can start to dig deep to find these correlations, and that can make you start to think that you're some kind of omniscient person, and that's not the case. And so there's that. But in terms of the positive impact for people who are going to move into a more disciplined mode with it and treat it more like a martial art, I think it has powerful impacts in health and well-being. So I do think that what I call controlled precognition is just more accurately called precognitive remote viewing. It's just remote viewing that's done where no one on the planet knows what the target is until the future. So you're not reading some tasker's mind, which people can do. You're actually looking into the future. Why does it have health benefits? I think partly because what you begin to learn, whether someone tells you this or not, is that you get better performance or better accuracy the more you can love yourself. So actually I showed this, that I wrote a paper where we looked at hypnosis and precognition, but we also measured people's experience of unconditional love. And the folks who had coming into the session had higher levels of unconditional love, were performing above chance on the precognition task, which we only gave them 2 minutes to do. It was super quick. It was not like normal remote viewing. And they were performing better than those who were at the lower end of the unconditional love scale. So that's the first little hint that there's a relationship with unconditional love. I got a grant from the Bial Foundation recently to follow that up, to look at unconditional love in a larger group of people, on the same type of task to see if that actually ends up bearing fruit and showing the same pattern. I suspect it will, just because when I teach people about this, I find that the biggest hurdle is their own blaming themselves for getting things wrong or listening to the wrong inner voice about what the target was. It's the biggest problem.
Right.
And what unconditional love says is it's all in there. Like, you are exactly where you need to be in your development of this skill. And tomorrow you will be in a new place, and that's exactly where you will need to be. And what is the same is this line across time that is the central core of who you are. And so these events that happen to you, I got it right, I got it wrong, I got it right, I got it wrong, I failed, I succeeded. They're just these external events in the story of that line. But that line is the thing that is the same. And as you identify with the line, that's an experience of unconditional love for yourself. It ends up being an experience of unconditional love for other people. Because it's very hard to unconditionally love yourself and then put conditions on other people. It's almost impossible. So it expands out in this kind of beautiful way from the core, from the essence of who you are, and identifying that over time as this one entity to the world. And failure and success are just little beads on your chain there.
Yep.
And feels really good. And when I'm in touch with it, it feels really good. And when I haven't gotten enough sleep, or I haven't worked out, or I haven't eaten the right foods for my body, it doesn't feel so good, but I'm still in touch with that inner peace. It's just that external, the little bead on the string at that moment is kind of grumpy, right? So it doesn't mean like people become suddenly blissful and everything's groovy. It's just a strengthening and an inner peace of like, this is what's happening now, and this is what's happening now, and this is what's happening now. And it's happening to this inner core, this essence. what does it look like when people actually take this information on board?
Yep.
And what can be developed from that. But just as an example, let's talk about Temperceuticals.
Please.
So Temperceuticals are this idea. Temperceuticals is a name thought of by the ION science team at the Institute of Noetic Sciences when we were talking about this idea. And I kind of ran with it because I think it's right up my alley. So it's this idea that certain kind of traumas that we have, like traumatic brain injury or stroke, these are physical traumas, certainly also emotional traumas, but even just talking about physical traumas, you hardly have any time up front, right? The event happens like that, and then you have to very quickly deal with it. It's an emergency situation,
Yep.
you know? And so the way we do it is we bring the person, you know, to the extent that we catch these things, right? You bring the person into the emergency room and you do all these tests and you do all these emergency measures and then you see how it goes. I think that's the way we do it now. But I think that I imagine a future in which we do all the things that we need to do to keep the person alive. But when there's time, which is after this emergent period, we then start using Temperceuticals to go back in time and influence some of the things in the past. And there's two schools of thought about this. One is, there's probably 1,000, but there's two schools of thought that I think are really compelling. One is you can actually change the past, even though something has been recorded. That can be a glitch in the computer system. Oh, it turns out that test wasn't, you know, the outcome wasn't what we thought.
Sure.
Or you can't change something that's been recorded, so you would only do the tests that were absolutely necessary. So there's room for shifting when you retrocausally shift something that could then be measured later. So both of those things I think need to be tested. And the way it would work would be intention. So you would actually work with the patient. And if they're not conscious, you would find someone who knew them well and work with that person. But I think ideally you'd work with the patient. And there are therapists who are doing this for psychological trauma. So one of the ones I talked to, she told me a wonderful story of this person who had PTSD because I forget if it was what the gender of the person was. Let's say it was a woman, because she was very injured. I think she was paralyzed as a result of a sledding accident. I think maybe it was a toboggan, so there were multiple people. Yes, there were multiple people on the toboggan. They were going downhill, ran into a tree, and that really changed her life.
Sure.
So she had PTSD from that. And she did the usual PTSD treatment, which is exposure therapy. So you basically tell the story multiple times from multiple points of view. And it allows the person to really understand what happened and also basically get exposed to those feelings enough so that they start to reduce. So it's the standard treatment and it does okay for some people. But this patient saw on one of these many storytelling times talking about this trauma, saw a little boy off to the side. And this was the first time that she remembered this or saw this in her mind's eye. And she realized that's why they all leaned away. And that's why they struck the tree. And after that one time, when she recognized that, she had a big release of emotion. And that was it for her. Like she was done because she realized she saved someone's life. Like she was paralyzed, but there was a reason for it. And the reason was they saved this child's life. And that's what did it for her. Now, was there actually a boy? No one knows. Did she insert that boy? Did her non-conscious processes insert that boy so that she could get on with her life? We don't know. it's very powerful. It seems to be more powerful than exposure therapy. There's this intention to heal the past after the event has happened that ends up feeling like it changes the experience of the past. Does it actually change the physical past is sort of the question of temporaceuticals. And I think the answer is yes. The reason I think the answer is yes is just intuition. So it's not like good enough, but it's not scientific data. But there's also a really neat experiment that was done on retrocausal prayer. I think the last name is Libowicki. And I think they did it as a joke. Like this idea like, okay, if this prayer stuff is really real, we should be able to pray for people in the past and it should affect them too. And then, so they had two groups of people that were randomly prayed for who had already left the hospital. They're already done with their, healing work there, but they're prayed for in the future, and half of them aren't prayed for. And the group that was prayed for, turns out, they analyzed the data after the prayer sessions. The group that was prayed for did better than the one that wasn't. So they were kind of embarrassed because the whole point was to say that this stuff was bogus. But to me, that's an indication that there's something going on. It seems to me that the future is not only in this handshake relationship with the past to create the present, which is people talk about this handshake, which is part of the two-state vector formalism that's been around for a while. This is an interpretation of quantum mechanics that say that the boundary conditions of the present are the past and the future. Okay. Not only is that the case, I kind of think the future has maybe even more input than the past. I mean, I think we might be experiencing the world in one direction, which is opposite to the primary direction in which it is being laid down. Experiencing the world in one direction, which is opposite to the primary direction in which it is being laid down.